Real pleasure to be here. So Peter Cheese, I'm the Chief Executive of the CIPD. If you're not familiar with our organisation, we're the professional body for HR and people development. We have about 170,000 members. Obviously, you look at a lot of the context and the Employment Rights Bill being part of it. This is a really, really important time for our profession. And my engagement with government and ministers, I keep reminding them, and a lot of it is going to have to be dealt with through our profession as well. So the good news is that, first of all, as Paul said, Paul and I have known each other quite a number of years now. I very, very much believe in this point about collaboration. We have got to work together across unions and employers and our profession, and indeed, of course, government as well. Interesting to note that within a month, or 6 weeks perhaps, of the election, the government had set up these tripartite meetings. So Paul was part of it and I was part of it. So we had sort of unions on one side, employers on the other side, government with Angela Rayner and Johnny Reynolds, and then their civil servants, and all looked, is this tripartite or what is this? The next meeting, if you remember it, Paul, they mixed it all up, didn't they? So,
but it's just Mick Lynch wanted to sit next to you.
Mick Lynch wanted, and he suddenly became my new best friend. So, but in that sense, I think the government leaning into this and saying, recognising, and they were very public about this, that the Employment Rights Bill represented the biggest set of changes in employment legislation that we've seen in decades. So they did very much say, right, there's going to be a consultative process. But it's been tough. I mean, we've been involved in most of the consultations. There's a hell of a lot. And there's still more to come. We know that the time frame for the implementation of the ERB is going to roll through into 2027. There's a lot of, as people sometimes like to put it, the devil in the detail. But also, change of minister already. I'm personally, I've met Kate Didden quite a number of times, and we had our annual conference up in Manchester last week, and she came up to the conference, and I interviewed her on the platform. I think she's a good person. I mean, the thing that I liked right from the outset, and indeed what you said, Paul, is you have to see this in a bigger context. If I say to employers, the ERB is going to solve growth and productivity, they're looking at it and saying, I don't know how that on itself is going to drive growth and productivity. So how does it fit with the wider narrative? You mentioned things like skills, Paul, but very much part of it, so the evolution or development of Skills England, the industrial strategy. Kate seems to be a good broad thinker and able to bring this narrative together, because I think we're all seeing the government is dealing with so many different things, and there's a very consistent point that's being made, is where is the clear narrative about where a lot of these things are leading us. But as I said, I think it's been good to see the consultation. Now, 28 measures in the Employment Rights Bill. I remember the very first meeting that we had, you probably remember it as well, Paul. So after statements from Angela Rayner and Johnny Reynolds, it immediately went to the line of employers, and the CBI were the first to comment, and the first thing that they said was, we don't like this unofficial, getting rid of the unfair dismissal qualification period. So we know, and I'll come back to this, there are 2 or 3 things that have sort of risen their heads quite a lot in this. But 28 different areas of the bill. I think there are a lot of positives in it. I think there are a lot of things, as rightly been said, that are helping to modernise employment relations and recognise that the world has changed. And it has. I mean, in the last even 10 years, let alone 20 years, there's a lot's changed. We are seeing different forms of employment relationship. We are operating in a very uncertain world. We know that we have skills challenges. We know we have the challenges of AI coming down the track and all the rest of it. So we've got to make sure that this is also fitting a world that is changing around us. I think, so you could look at things like better protections, maternity and parental leave, bereavement, sick pay. There are a number of good things in there, I think, really helping to protect and reassure employees. But we also know that many employees don't know their rights today. So we've got, when we talk about educating people, we've got to educate employers. And we've certainly got to make sure that we as unions, and indeed we as a professional body and others like ACAS, are providing good guidance and support. But part of this is going to be how do we engage our employees as well and help them understand these things. I would say from a business side, there are definitely concerns. As I said, I picked out one particular one. But in general, they'll look at a lot of these things and say, isn't that just going to add to the cost of employment? So even if I looked at, say, day 1 rights on sick leave, and they do need to model some of these things and understand them. You will have heard and you will have seen it in the press and the media that recruitment is slowing. Now, people will attribute that to all sorts of things. A number of employers, of course, said from the last budget with the increase in national insurance, for example, and then you look at the ERB, that their cost of employment is going up, and we're having to think much harder about who and when we recruit. Others have said, well, this is all about AI. I don't need to recruit as many people because I can use AI. Now, how much is truth in all of those things, who knows? I think the fact remains that we are in uncertain economic times. We have slow growth. The last month figures just came out yesterday, which were, I think the official term is disappointing. So we know we still have significant economic headwinds, and when businesses are in those sorts of circumstances, they tend to revert to rather short-term thinking, very risk-averse, and say, well, what's one of our biggest costs? And it is people. So as I said, we are already seeing, and we've seen it now through the growth of the unemployment figures are starting to climb, and I do also have genuine concerns for young people. I think when you look at a lot of the sort of future work, a lot of the debate from organizations saying, well, maybe some of these lower entry-level jobs could be automated. That is a real concern. And moving from what some people have described as a pyramid-shaped organization more to a diamond-shaped organization. So in other words, just to echo Paul's point, that we have a lot of bigger things which we also need to make sure that we are working together on. I think when you look at it now in terms of other things around the ERB, there are the questions about the tribunal system, and that this is going to add more to that workload of the tribunal system. That has been acknowledged by government. It's certainly been called out by employers, and therefore has ACAS got the resources through all of this, and the CAC do we need, and we have advocated for that there needs to be more support, more resources through those sorts of channels and mechanisms as well. Paul mentioned the role of the Fair Work Agency. That is forming. It's still not the detail of exactly what it should do. I think it's still in some discussion. But I think whatever it does, yes, of course, it should be looking at compliance and governance, things like that. But it should also be looking at guidance. Yeah, and that should be true for the government too. And we have pressed that point consistently, that in launching the bill, there needs to be really, really good guidance. And we want to play our part in that. I know the unions want to play their part in that. We all need to play our part in providing that. When I was talking to Kate Dearden last week, I said, so is this timetable still on? Yeah, the Royal Assent before the end of the year. And she said, I hope so. I think she was slightly being a little guarded, because I said there are still quite a number of areas of discussion to be had. And other things that I think are really important to us, like how do we grow, and Paul, you touched on this, but how do we grow some of the capabilities in organizations to work well together between unions and employers? What used to be called IR or IRER. And I remember I've been talking about this for 10 years or more, that when I've talked to an organization, say, that skill set's been atrophying. And if I say, look, it's a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it sat within the sort of HR domain space. We sort of moved away from that real stuff around negotiation and working with unions, more towards the sort of broader construct of employment relationships. It's not all bad, but what it does mean is that there is a need to build those skills, and I think those skills need to be built, incidentally, in organizations. I think they need to be built in unions, which is part of Paul's point, and I think to some extent they've got to be built in government as well, because government gets involved in a lot of big negotiations. Just to talk about a couple of things where we are exactly on this employment rights bill, therefore. We are on this ping-pong stage. I think we're about to hit the third pong, or whatever it is, back from Commons to the Lords. The things that the Lords have put forward, and I was in the House of Lords yesterday talking about some of this with some of the Lords, I think at the moment almost everything they put forward has been rejected, which is kind of interesting. And indeed in the tripartite meetings, when the employers have banged on the table, I remember one meeting where I think it was Justin Madders at the time said, this is what's going to happen, it's about day one rights, and we're not going to change, we're not going to budge. And then some of the employers saying, right, well, we want this change and that change and something else. And I said, I think you just heard them. And incidentally, so much of this was within the manifesto, and therefore to Paul's point that I don't think the government is. Whatever I might think, or what some employers and some of the detail, I think we're still probably in a place where the government is going to push ahead with what is currently in the bill. And I know that the unions have been very vocal about this, no watering down. But as I said, I think there are areas that we must discuss some of the detail as to how this is going to work effectively. So the current consultations are interesting. Kate called them out. So the enhanced dismissal protections for pregnant women and new mothers, the leave for bereavement, including pregnancy loss, day one rights. I think those are manageable. But then we've got 2 out of the 5 big areas that are being debated around trade union rights. So the first is on the duty to inform workers of the right to join a union, and what are the practical implications of that, both digital as well as in practice, and the trade union rights of access. And I want to talk about those a little bit, because when we talk about some of the things for employers that are interesting in terms of the debate, and we've had quite a lot of discussions, of course, on all aspects of this within our own membership community. We had some very interesting discussions last week about the practicalities of some of these things. So if it was sort of full right for every union just to knock on the door and say, we're coming to talk to your organisation, I mean, I think, Paul, you made the point, that could create a lot of competition between the unions. I mean, I've in talking to organisations who already have a significant union presence, and you might have one union that's already got 40% of the workforce, well, they're not going to welcome with open arms 3 other unions knocking on the door and say, well, we want a piece of the pie, thank you very much. That doesn't, so exactly as Paul said, we need to understand how that's going to work. And does it need legislation? I'm not sure. I think trade union or TUC affiliation would help, because as you said, you've got those rules. But not every union is affiliated. Now we have the other thing that's emerging, which is so-called pop-up unions. You've heard about this? So more of what are being described as pop-up unions, which might be quite single-issue kind of things. I mean, for example, faith-based unions. Now, are people going to say, well, you know what, I have a particular issue into the workplace around, I don't know, certain protected rights, protected characteristics, and I want to set up a union that's going to just focus on that, but not necessarily being affiliated, and still trying to use this legislation to say, I have the right of access into your workplace. This could get pretty confusing pretty quickly. So I think, as I said, there's some very practical things here about things like the right of access into the workplace, which actually we need to be working together. We need TUC support on this, because I think you do have some good ways of thinking about these things. Other things that related to that, I think, were what are the communication mechanisms, the digital stuff, how often do they need to be told? But what I did want to move on to is also recognition, I think, by many, that actually, from the union standpoint, you've got some work to do to convince people. And I say that advisedly. As has already been commented, we know that the union membership is strong in the public sector, but it is much lower in the private sector. We also know that over the last decades that union membership has declined. We also know that many employers have created other channels and mechanisms to have their employees have their voice heard, and these staff forums and all these other things. And indeed, one of the things that employers are doing at the moment is saying, let's have a look at that and strengthen it, because if they're worried about unions coming in, then they say, well, if I strengthen all the mechanisms for voice and consultation processes with my employees, maybe the employers have said, well, I don't really need unions. So we went out and researched this over the course of earlier in the year, and asked questions like, to what extent does your organisation support or oppose the introduction of these new rights to access workplaces for recruitment and organising purposes? What was interesting is there's quite a stark difference between those organisations that are already working with the unions and those who aren't. I'm going to give you some of the numbers. So supporting all of this, for those workforces or organisations that have strong union representation, over 50% of them were supportive, or they were neither supportive nor opposing, was a further 22%. So getting close to 3/4 of organisations already working with the union saying, yeah, we could probably deal with this, it's okay. You then look at it from the point of view of the organisations that do not have unions, and it was only 21% supported and 33% neither supported or opposed. So there's a strong difference. And as we talk to employers, because the reality is, if we're honest, is unions, I mean, it's like so many things in life, isn't it? The media picks up on all the negative stuff. The media loves demonizing things. And then we'll read about unions, and many organizations think that the unions just come in there to cause trouble, to get all their members out on strike and stuff like that. So we need to be very cognizant of that and say, all right, so what have we got to do to manage some of these things? You know, when I talk to small businesses, they're saying, oh my God, I can't deal with all of this. And I said, but first of all, let's look at it from a practical and logistical perspective. Do we imagine that the unions are going to have time to talk to every single one of our SMEs across this country? No, more likely the unions are going to focus on you all will focus on the bigger organizations. And certainly, as Paul has touched on, getting more representation in the private sector. I've already talked about potential competition between unions and pop-up unions. And hence affiliation with the TUC. But it is the unions able to make your case. Because as I said, if people haven't worked, they just have this image of what unions do. Now you do so many positive things in workplaces, helping focus attention on employee rights, but also skills and culture and many other things that we can all see. But you will have to make your case. And as I said, in particular, working with private sector employers and employees. So coming into it collaboratively, working in support with the employer is going to be a very important part of this. And therefore, to come back to the guidance and what we want to try and see from all of this is, it is also, therefore, it's not just about training people, but it's also guidance on what does a good social partnership look like. And we have many, many examples of it. You know, we've been talking with the NHS, and we've been talking, for example, in Wales, they have some good partnerships. We need to draw out these really good frameworks. What does a good social partnership really look like? When it works well, it can benefit all. So let's try to bring those things out. Let's try to train people on them. Let's try to provide that guidance that so many organizations are going to need on this, so we can get to a good place in the end. And finally, therefore, in terms of things that, as I said, just to complete a couple of thoughts on how employers are responding to this. As I said, first of all, they're not all against it, for sure, but they are concerned about some of the clauses. They're concerned about some of the things I've already mentioned in terms of access to workplaces for unions. These debates about things like the unfair dismissal qualification period, I think, are interesting. And I've always commented, recruitment is not a perfect process. Now, you know, a lot of the dialogue I've heard around this is about protecting people from bad employers. Yeah, but there are also, frankly, some not very good employees out there. And if we're honest, there are also some not very good unions out there. And we've got to be honest about some of these things and recognize that in things like recruitment, we need those checks and balances. Now, this will come into some of that detailed consultation, which has not yet happened, on how would things like a statutory probationary period work. Zero-hours contract is another one, as I said, that keeps coming up. I'm very happy with the word exploitative, but there are zero-hours contracts that work well on all sides. And you know, I think the way the legislation has been crafted at the moment is to recognise that there should be some choice in the matter as well. But also there are other debates, and again, this is a good example of the devil in the detail, of what is the reference period. If I've been working for a period of time, I think it's perfectly reasonable if you have regular hours, that should be turned into a regular hours contract. But a lot of sectors, for example, like hospitality, say, but the problem is this is very seasonal. You know, my demand is very seasonal. So there are details like that, as I said, to be worked through. But overall, you know, I stand here before you saying, all right, let's work together. Let's, you know, echo some of Paul's points. Let's help to provide the guidance and support that we're all going to need. Let's encourage the government to talk about this in a collective way in terms of how is all of this supporting overall growth. And we've also got to work together to make sure, as I said, that organisations of all kinds do understand what this is about, that they're implementing it effectively and not seeing it as a whole series of penalties or additional burden or compliance issues that is going to discourage them from recruiting more people and growing. And that, I think, is one of the overriding concerns that we would all have. So thank you very much. I think we've probably got a few minutes. Well, probably not, actually. I think we've exhausted our time. Paul and I could both talk for England on these subjects, but I'll hand it back to Becky. Thank you.